Morning. All right, good morning.
Good morning.
How's everyone?
Good.
Yeah, right, have a good weekend. Week 2, I think we're already in the second week of the semester, right? It's practically over. No, I'm just kidding. It just started, right? Let's not get carried away.
Please don't, I don't want to wait for Christmas, please.
No, right? Well, we are all decorated for Halloween in my house, so it feels like we're way farther than we actually are. My kids are like, can we go do Halloween stuff? I'm like, it's August, like nobody else has Halloween stuff quite yet. Well, like some of the stores do, but that's about it. Anyway, we'll pick up where we left off. Keep going with chapter 1. And we spent a lot of time last time, right? Like talking about those 5 Ds of abnormality. Can anyone give me one of those Ds? What was duration? What's another one? One. What was that? Deviance. Okay, that's 2. Another, yeah. Distress. Dysfunction. And what? Discomfort. Right. Danger. Right. And I was trying to keep track of the 5 in my head at that point. Right. So if we go back. Right, so remember, these were the Ds, right? And they're not diagnostic criteria, right? You're not going to look in the DSM, which we're going to talk about later in the semester, and see like deviance and distress, dysfunction, danger, duration, all of those, right? But they are, again, those kind of guidelines like we were talking about, according to the DSM, of things that are going to kind of be red flag that somebody might be struggling with mental illness. So that was kind of our big thing that we talked about last time. And then what we'll look at today are some of the like early views of abnormality. And then we'll talk about some of the different careers and kind of focuses of the field. We're still kind of setting the stage for a couple of weeks. And if we look back, it's pretty shameful. And I think I mentioned this last time. It's pretty shameful, some of the things that we've done to people in the name of trying to cure or treat mental illness. It took us a long time to get to ideas of things like therapy and stuff that we have today. I'm sure lots of you have seen the movie Shutter Island. Love that movie, really interesting. There's a little clip in there where he kind of like rambles on about some of the things that we've done. I want to play it for you. It's only about a moment. Sorts of bizarre things like that. And you see images coming out of this time of like people in bizarre cribs and chairs and spinning people and submerging them in ice baths and all these different kind of things in an effort to treat. And it took a long time for us to get to where we are today, and kind of a lot of trial and error. And even now we're still trying to figure out how to treat mental illness properly, but we've definitely come a long way since like the most ancient views and things that we have written down. So if we go all the way back to like our first recorded ideas of mental illness, it was thought that any kind of abnormal behavior was the work of like evil spirits or magical beings, that people who had mental illness were possessed, right? Possessed by the devil, possessed by a demon, an evil spirit of some kind. And that was what was causing them to act abnormally. And so if people were possessed, our treatment had to focus on forcing those demons out of the body somehow. And two of the ways that we did that were through procedures called trepanations and exorcisms, right? Trephination, that's what happened in that picture up there that you can see with that skull. We would take an instrument and cut away circular sections of the skull to allow the evil spirits to escape. Now, as you could probably imagine, a lot of people died during these procedures, right? They were often fatal, or people would be kind of like brain dead afterward, in which case sometimes we considered it a success. They would go from agitated and angry and loud to quiet and subdued. And the reason for that was we damaged their brain so badly, right, that they didn't have the ability to function. But trephination left these circular holes for the demons to escape from. It's a very popular procedure for years, different from a lobotomy, where you drill a hole in the frontal lobe or in the two sides and the temples. This was specifically to let the demons escape. Much more common than that, exorcisms. Exorcisms, which are still practiced today, just not as frequent and definitely not for the same reasons as they were in the past, was a practice of coaxing evil spirits out of a body. Right. And this typically required a young priest and an old priest, if you watch a lot of horror movies, right? It's been featured in a lot of different movies. These are just a few. I'm a huge horror movie fan. Anyone else like horror movies? Right. Well, I'm not alone. And it's the perfect time of year for these, right? My 12-year-old was like, can we watch The Conjuring? I'm like, no, you're not quite there yet. Maybe next. But a lot of movies feature exorcisms, right? It's a very common theme of like people acting bizarrely. It must be possession. And at this period of time, we thought it was possession, right? And so oftentimes a priest would come in, or multiple priests, to try and get somebody to feel better by having that spirit leave their body. Was that oh, I thought it was a hint. And again, sometimes people would die during these procedures, right? They could be very violent and sometimes effective, sometimes not. And it's a huge theme in these horror movies, looking at, is it possession or is it mental illness? And a couple of these movies actually focus quite a bit on that. Like The Exorcism of Emily Rose is all about, does she have schizophrenia or is she possessed, right? And these are often questions of like, how do you view a phenomenon? If you're viewing it through the lens of faith, sometimes people look at possession. If you're viewing it through the lens of science and psychology, we would look at mental illness. And there's a really like kind of a cool debate about that in the movie The Right. And I have a clip of it that I'll play for you. Nothing scary. There's no like, if you're not a scary movie fan, I won't scare movie, along with a couple others, right? Is it possession or is it mental illness? And when they're talking about someone being psychotic, as a side note, psychosis or psychotic means that you've lost contact with reality. It's typically people who have things like schizophrenia. It's a really common psychotic disorder, probably the most common one. And what they would do at the time, again, is practice these exorcisms. And now, in theory, an exorcism could work if somebody believes that they're possessed, right? It's kind of like that placebo effect. But now we would tend to view from a psychological lens, we'd view it as mental illness rather than possession. But that wasn't the case for a lot of years, where this was really the dominant way to treat mental illness. It like appeared this way, and so we would exercise or trephinate people as a way to cure them. And a lot of people didn't, sadly, a lot of people didn't survive those procedures. Any like thoughts or comments or anything for now? Anything so far? But exorcisms early in the morning? As we move forward, we shifted a little bit. And you see there's so much in psychology, right? Psychology loves to have all these different like paradigms or views, ways of viewing a different like phenomenon. And so we had years and years where it was possession, right? And so we treated it with exorcisms. And then as we moved into the Greek and Roman times, we shifted a little bit to more of like a medical model. This was a period of time that was very dominated by early physicians, people like Hippocrates, who was called the father of modern medicine. And so rather than thinking that mental illness had a spiritual cause, he was the first to propose that it had more of like a biological or natural cause, that the way that mental illness would manifest was if you had an imbalance of what he called humors, that we all possess these four like fluids that ran through our body that he called humors. And if they were out of proportion, then you would have mental illnesses as a result. And so in theory, what he would do is they would do something called bloodletting, which was very dangerous. You remove blood from somebody's body. And sometimes they remove too much blood as one of the treatments for these things. But if you remove blood from someone's body and let it sit, and draw like what looks like maybe a little beaker, you'll learn very quickly, drawing is not my strong suit, but that's okay. But if you took blood from someone and you let it sit for a period of hours, it separates into 3 layers. So now he had a 4th, but it only separates into 3. At the top, you would have his, what he called yellow bile. And yellow bile is like the serum or plasma that you would find in blood. And people who had too much yellow bile were thought to be like frenzied. So too much of it would be very like frenzied or manic. Like you'd have way too much energy, right? And it would require treatment. And so the idea here is that we're looking at like physical things in your body and how they correlate to mental illness or components of mental illness. The next layer that you would get would be the phlegm. Like snot, right? Phlegm, right? Gross to think that somebody could have too much phlegm and then that would cause you to have problems. But this is like the white blood cells. That would be what that layer would equate to. And too much phlegm often meant that you were viewed as like being lazy or like apathetic, right? Overly tired, like sluggish, like think of slow moving, like phlegm, gross, right? And so for, again, each one of these, there were treatments to try and like change that proportion in your system, right? This one, therapeutic vomiting was the most common treatment to like get rid of phlegm. Like we would give you herbs to make you vomit to reduce the amount of phlegm in your system, thereby increasing your energy and so on. Again, very early ideas of like biological stuff. The next layer underneath that would be blood, which are your red blood cells, right? That layer in your blood. And with this one, too much blood, we thought you were overly cheerful. Which doesn't sound so bad, right? Like overly happy, overly cheerful. And so with this one, leeches, bloodletting, very common practices, super dangerous practices, but we would remove blood from the body with leeches and so on in order to put the blood back into balance. And then finally, at the bottom, you had the black bile. Black bile was like that dark sludgy layer. It's not an actual layer that you would see blood divide into, but it's like a thin layer of dark material at the bottom. And with this one, too much of this was unshakable sadness. Right? Melancholy, depression, right? So if people had too much black bile, it was thought that they were like going to be depressed, right? And so there were all these kind of ideas, very early ideas, that the different proportions of things in your body could equate to mental illness. Now, this has been like not found to have any biological support to it, but it was a very early idea looking at natural or physical causes for mental illness, very different from the perspective that came before. And again, each one kind of dictated its own type of treatment in order to put the body back into balance. Yeah. It could be, right? And those would be early things that we maybe wouldn't have had any information. It could have very easily skewed the results, right? If somebody had something that was out of balance naturally due to some other medical cause, it might appear very off, right? And so again, not something that is held up over time, and it probably had no basis then. It was very correlational, but it was just kind of an early idea to lead us to where we are today. Moving into like the Middle Ages and Renaissance, we go back to spirituality again. The Middle Ages were a big, big time of the church. The clergy, especially in Europe, possessed so much power. And so any kind of psychological dysfunction at this point, specifically the devil, not demons or like bad spirits, but the devil, right? Satan's influence specifically. And so when people showed any kind of sign of psychosis or mental illness, it was thought to be the work of the devil. right? And this is where some of these odd like treatments start to come forward. They had this impossible situation that was very common in the witch hunts, and a lot of ideas that some of the witch hunts and witches maybe were suffering from mental illnesses, which made them seem like odd or bizarre outwardly. But they had this situation where they would put women, it was traditionally or typically women, on the end of a long pole, right? And then they would dunk them in the water. If they were a witch, they would drown, right? If they weren't a witch, they would admit it. And then like, it was like this situation where like you couldn't win, right? Like you were either found guilty of witchcraft and you drowned, or you were found not guilty of witchcraft and then you went to like early asylums or like somewhere like that where you were held. But it was a very common practice at the time to do things, again, like exorcisms and trepanations and things like that, to get the demon or Satan out of your system and cure you of mental illness. It wasn't until the Renaissance, which is a period of like rebirth and very like artistic intellectual thought, that we saw a little bit of a shift toward different types of treatment. And we developed something, a man named Johann Weyer developed something called the asylum. Now, when you hear the word asylum, what do you picture? Like, what comes into your mind the second you hear that word? Like, do you have a thought or an image or like an association? What are some of the things you think of with asylum? Anybody have one? Yeah.
I was kind of thinking the Joker. Okay.
Okay.
Another movie just coming out.
That's a hard one to watch. The Joker is a
Yeah.
hard movie to watch, right? Okay. Yeah.
Bunch of people like tied up in
Like straight jackets. Mhm.
Craziness. I don't know, very dark.
Okay. Yeah, all like common associations. Anyone else think you think of? Yeah. Totally, me too, right? That second season of American Horror Story, in Asylum, the whole thing was related to that. Anyone else? Things you picture? Is it positive? Is it a positive association? No, right? Like I picture like filth and darkness and bizarre like things and people being crowded and like all negative stuff. The asylum was meant to be a very positive thing. It was developed with wonderful intentions. Dr. Johann Weyer said he wanted a place where people could escape like the cares of the world, right? Or the troubles of the world. And so it was meant to be this place where people could go seek safety or asylum, right? In a place where they could receive some kind of treatment. The problem is we had no idea how to treat people who had mental illness, and you could literally be locked in here for any reason, especially if you were female. A husband could have his wife admitted to an asylum for not having sex with him, right? There was no like justification required. And this is where we got some of these odd things like these cribs that you see here. They would lock people in cribs for days. They would spin people in chairs until they passed out, right? There were a lot of very bizarre practices that came out of this period of time. And again, asylums were supposed to be a very positive thing, but that's not at all what they were, right? They were overcrowded, people rotted in their own filth, and they were often almost like a jail for people struggling with mental illness. The most infamous, so famous in a bad way, of these asylums was a place in London called Bethlehem Hospital. Massive. A lot of these asylums, especially these early ones, were palaces. They were sometimes palaces for lunatics. You get this term lunatic coming out of this period of time where we're almost relating the behavior of people to the moon, right? Like Luna and moon and lunar cycles. But this one was the most infamous of all, right? And it really kind of started this idea of asylums becoming popular. There's a whole documentary about this, but I found a little excerpt. They show you some images from it, which is kind of interesting. So let me play that for you, and then we can talk about it. A huge reputation. And the word Bethlehem, or the name of the hospital, actually evolved over time. So it started out as Bethlehem, and then it became Bethlehem, and then it became Bedlam. So Bedlam, which I have down here, means chaos, right? And so it was kind of this idea of a place where people who had madness or were chaotic were put in order to get better. But the sad thing again is we had no idea how to treat these people. So oftentimes just really awful conditions, people like living in filth, overcrowded, no idea how to help them. And that was a big problem for like hundreds of years, as we had no idea how to cure or treat mental illness. But Bethlehem became Bedlam, which again is like synonymous with madness or chaos. Into the 19th century, we started to get a little bit better, right? So again, asylums had a good intention. They just like didn't have the resources and things to back them up. As we got into the 1800s, there was this new movement that came out called moral treatment. It was an idea that let's treat people who have mental illness with respect and morality, right? It was like this whole controversial wave, right? Rather than locking people away in asylums and doing all these cruel and bizarre treatments to them, let's try and promote respectful treatment where people have like a right and agency in the treatment that they're receiving. And so out of this movement, we formed the state hospital. The state hospital was meant to be like, I'm going to fix all of the issues of the asylum. It's going to be better. It's going to be funded by the state. Sadly, it ran into almost all the same issues, right? So the state hospital, although a little bit better and kind of guided by these moral treatment ideas, still didn't know how to cure people, still ran into issues of like staffing shortages and like all the same things that asylums did, but had a little bit better like mentality behind it. And the people who really promoted that were a couple of different psychologists that had like a big early role. One of them was a man named Philippe Pinel. And here's an image out of time from the Paris Asylum for Insane Women. And there was this idea of like removing the shackles, removing the chains, having people not be prisoners anymore. Pinel believed in talking to people and kind of checking in with them instead of doing things like bleeding them and starving them or putting them in those bizarre cribs. It was just a shift that we saw in the 1800s of trying to treat people through more like psychological means and like respect and dignity rather than locking them away like we did before. So kind of an idea of shifting from asylums and like being prisoners to something a little more progressive. We also saw kind of another cool piece of art out of this time. Dance in a Madhouse, or also called the Lunatic Ball, was a very popular idea in the early days of moral treatment to hold huge parties or balls for the people who were in these facilities. So all the people in the state hospital would get together, they'd dress up, and they'd have a big dance. And you can see here they're portraying them as being like mentally ill, but their faces are all disfigured, very common technique in like early art. But we would let people try to have meaning and dignity and purpose and social interactions for the first time. So it was a new mentality that again ran into a lot of the same issues, but kind of a few interesting pieces of art that came out of that time. Lots of movies featuring these as well, right? Shutter, I played you a clip from American Horror Story, like you mentioned, or movies and shows, but lots and lots of movies and shows featuring psychiatric hospitals. Some of them in kind of like a darker, earlier way, some in more of like a contemporary way. But perfect time of year for this topic. Was that a?
Yeah, I was gonna mention that there was a Benedict Cumberbatch movie that came out not too long ago that kind of relates to this too.
Okay,
I forget what the name on top of my head, but
if it comes back to you, you have to let me
yeah,
know.
it's a movie I was gonna do for the later in class too.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, let me know if you remember. Yeah,
Still doing the rescue.
they're still doing.
Like they were on bed rest.
Oh.
Like 3 hours.
Yeah, for sure. Right, all the way up until like the mid to late 1900s, right? Here we're doing a lot of those things. Like psychiatric drugs didn't come out until like the 1950s and 1960s. And then we started even doing lobotomies and things still. Right, so those practices continued for a long time because we didn't know what else to do. And again, people would go from like agitated to very quiet. And oftentimes because they suffered great damage or trauma. But yeah, we did those things for a very long time. Through the early 19, even mid 19, for sure. There's another, is there another hint? Yeah. What's it called? Yes.
So Linda is a model character with DID.
Okay.
And so like this whole thing is kind of giving up that. How would people like back then, and when they do people with DID, like what
Yeah.
was their common thing?
I mean, you view it as possession, right? It was most likely viewed in that light, or just completely misunderstood, right? And so oftentimes they would just lock people away, where they wouldn't be a danger to themselves or others. As we got a little farther later, we started doing things like electroconvulsive therapy or shock therapy, insulin therapy, things to try and like change their states. But it was probably that they were locked away, right? And kind of confined, almost like a solitary isolation kind of situation, because their behavior would often be viewed as possession. And that's still a tough one to treat. It's still a hard disorder to treat now, but we have medications and therapies now, but that's probably what they would have done back then. Yeah.
It's electrical electro, voice ring.
Okay. Yeah, I have not seen it, but interesting, right? Couple of fun things to look up. I love it. Thank you. Any other thoughts or comments here? These state hospitals, if I go back, are still like, there are very few of them now, right? State hospitals are something that, again, like started to really kind of in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And what we saw somewhere around like the 1980s or so, these started to fall out of favor. And almost overnight, a lot of them became abandoned or just kind of shut down. It's almost like the people who were in them were released in favor of more like community treatment sort of things. And so you ended up with a lot of like abandoned psychiatric hospitals across the country, where they were either abandoned or committed to other things like Cal State Channel Islands, for example. My first job, my very first psychology job was at a, I didn't get paid for it, but I was like in the field, right? I felt good anyway. I was basically like a glorified runner. Like I would sit in on group therapy at the psychiatric hospital in San Diego and then go get whoever, like if they needed something, I'd go get it, but I got to sit in on therapy. So it was so interesting. And that building is now a YMCA, which is just bizarre to me to see, right? Where we used to do group therapy, people are now working out, right? Like different type of therapy, I guess. But a lot of these places were shut down and converted. I went to a really cool experience up in, I think it's like Willits or Ukiah, like kind of Northern California. There was this place that was a psychiatric hospital that was converted to a Buddhist monastery. And I took a 1-unit class called on Buddhism, just to take something interesting in college. And we got to stay in this abandoned psychiatric hospital as part of that class. And I was so excited and terrified at the same time. But it was amazing because they separated the boys and the girls so that we wouldn't be tempted. And I got to sleep in a room with my partner. I was like, oh, good, separate us, please, right? So we were in the same room together, so I felt safe. But it was like this really creepy old building, everything like green tile, had a very like negative energy to it. And there were even buildings there that the monks said that they couldn't cleanse of their energy, and they kept them abandoned, right? So you see across our country, there's tons of these massive buildings that were abandoned almost overnight in favor of smaller kind of treatments. And I found a cool compilation of that on YouTube. And it's just set to some music. I think it's like a Radiohead song, but a lot of them just kind of became abandoned very quickly, right? And so a lot of people just released or put into more like community care kind of treatments. But these state hospitals fell out of favor, right? And they're definitely not the most common way of treating mental illness anymore. We have kind of abandoned these large facilities for much smaller kind of approaches, right? But that was like the dominant idea for a lot of years. And again, you can still see them kind of scattered across the country or converted into other things like schools and YMCAs and Buddhist monasteries, right? Best part about that class, I was thinking about it during the clip, they had the best food. Right? They believed it, like you wouldn't think it, right? But the monks, great cooks, right? They have these rolls that I will never forget. Like it's almost like lembas bread from like Lord of the Rings, where you ate one of them and you were full for like a year, right? They were amazing. I was thinking about the rolls as we're watching the clip. I could keep that to myself, but I'll share it with you anyway. It's like it's food time. It's always food. So some of the things that we look at now, like these are some of the things that we are really big on at the moment. Right. And as we moved out of like the 80s and 90s into the 2000s, we started to really kind of embrace these things instead of some of the mentalities that came before. Medication. We'll talk about medication all semester, right? For every disorder that we cover. there are medications that are prescribed to help with it, right? So psychotropic medications are huge when it comes to current trends in the field, right? Along with different types of brain stimulation methods that are becoming very popular. And we have a lot of different approaches that focus on biology and altering your chemistry. We also, a big wave of deinstitutionalization. That's what happened when we closed all those institutions. We started trying to treat people more in like the community. It's much more common for people to just go to like private therapy rather than going and being institutionalized in these big places. There aren't very many of them left anymore. They're more like wings of smaller hospitals now. And so we are more in favor of like private psychotherapy or group therapy, which we'll talk about as well, where you go and you meet with someone one-on-one rather than being hospitalized or kind of locked away like we did for years and years. Cyber therapy has become super popular, especially during COVID. A lot of people went to like Zoom or kind of online versions of therapy. And there's a hybrid of that. A lot of people will do more traditional one-on-one, and some people do this online now as well. You can go either way. And prevention, focusing on identifying things early and trying to kind of deter things before they develop. What are some of the early warning signs that someone might be on the path to depression or anxiety or schizophrenia or whatever it might be? And how can we try and maybe intervene early to reduce that likelihood? Right. So these are some of the things that we see like pretty heavily used now in the field, right? Kind of moving away from some of the bizarre, more kind of out there treatments to things that are a little more like grounded, a little more scientifically based. Any thoughts, questions, comments, anything? We still have a couple slides left here, but anything so far? Just as we have a lot of disagreement about how do we decide if someone is like normal versus abnormal, subjective terms, right? How do we know what is treatment? We have all these different types of treatment that we're going to talk about all semester. And there's still a lot of like wiggle room when it comes to treatment as well. And trying to keep this purposefully broad because everybody has a different belief system. Everybody has different like approaches to things. And so when we try and define treatments, right, we have kind of 3 essential features to any treatment that we talk about this semester. You have somebody who's suffering, who seeks relief from someone who is a healer. Well, that's really broad. Suffering could mean anything, healer could mean anything, and that's purposefully broad. The healer is somebody that you accept. You accept their experience and their background. So let's say you go to your medical doctor as someone to help you with like psychological issues, or you go to a priest or a rabbi, or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, right? We're leaving room for like a wide variety of people to provide services. And then you have a series of contacts between the healer and the sufferer, right? Whether that's somebody prescribing you medication and you go to check on that, or somebody that you seek therapy from and you have interactions weekly or bi-weekly with them, or a priest through confession, right? However you are approaching this, the idea is that you have a series of contacts to help you get better. And so just as much disagreement here on what is treatment as there is like what is mental illness, but we leave it purposefully broad to cover lots of different types of treatment as we move through the semester. Anyone in here, before I go to the next slide, anyone in here thinking of going into the field of psychology as like a counselor, therapist, something in this field? Ideas and any ideas what you want to do? Like, I won't hold you to it, but anyone have like a thought what you're leaning toward and working toward? Couple hands over here. Yeah, what are you thinking? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to do,
Okay,
it was not LinkedIn.
awesome. Okay, love that. Right. There were a couple other hands. Anybody else like early ideas what you want to do? I don't want to commit to it, right? Yeah.
College advisor.
Okay, great. Right. Working with people, advising people. Lots of different professions in this field, right? It's kind of a unique in that way that there's so many different things that you can do. Sometimes it's a little bit daunting, right? With a degree in psychology, your options are really, really open, but you do unfortunately typically need like higher level degrees in order to do all of these things, like a master's degree or a PhD or even a PsyD. But lots of different professions here. There's obviously people who are counselors, clinical or counseling or psychiatry, school psychologists, social workers, clinical researchers, teachers, right? The list goes on and on and on. But there's a lot of different things that you can do. And I want to take a minute to kind of talk about these first three and kind of break them down a little bit because they're a little bit different. So I'm going to make a little chart up here. You might want to copy down. Let's see, so we have psychiatrists. See if I left myself enough room. Maybe, maybe not. So we have clinical. Do counseling first. Counseling, clinical, and psychiatrists. Okay, so three different professions that often kind of get lumped together, but they do all have slightly different focuses and backgrounds, right? And they make different amounts of money. They have different like clients that they tend to work with. So if we look first at education, in order to be a counseling psychologist, you need a master's degree or an MA. So a master's, and these typically take like 2 to 3 years after your bachelor's degree. So you get your bachelor's degree and then like 2 to 3 more years to get a master's degree. I have a master's in counseling psychology. That's my educational background. And I was training to be a counseling therapist, or an MFT, as we call them in California, marriage and family therapist. A clinical psychologist has a little bit more education. They tend to have a PhD, which is 5 to 7 years after your bachelor's. So more education, right? More training. And this doesn't include all of the hours that you have to do as like an internship before you take the licensing exam to get your license to practice. This is just like the schooling and education. And then a psychiatrist has a medical degree or an MD, and this is 7+ years, right? Has the most education, the most involvement, but a medical degree. So different levels of education for each one of these individuals. They all have kind of a different scope and practice. Their focus is different as well as a result, right? What they do on kind of like a daily basis. Counseling psychologists tend to work with like everyday problems. Anxiety, depression, relationships, stress, right? Kind of, I won't say lighter things, but more like typical everyday kind of stuff. Clinical psychologists, because they have more education, tend to work more with more severe like psychological disorders. So maybe someone with schizophrenia or more pronounced depression, right? They tend to work with more severe populations. This can get a little bit interchangeable, but somebody who has a counseling degree has less education and background. So if someone is more severe, they might need to be referred to someone with more training and education. Psychiatrists have a completely different focus. Anyone know what it is? What do they do that makes them different? Yeah. Medication. So when you go to a psychiatrist, their focus is on medication, right? And so it's not uncommon for someone to have a psychiatrist and one of these other two, right? Maybe you go to someone for more like traditional therapy, and then you also have a psychiatrist or maybe your medical doctor that prescribes you medication. Right? You sometimes see that as well. In terms of the appointment, counseling and clinical psychologists will see you for 50 minutes. That's the therapy hour, 50 minutes. I don't know who decided that, but 50 minutes instead of an hour. It's a longer session where you're doing some kind of like talking or techniques or working through the things that brought you in. Psychiatrists, typically about 20 minutes, much, much shorter. And the whole appointment, they're focusing on what are your side effects? How are you tolerating the medication? Do we need to go up or down in your dosage? Kind of focusing on that, which is why you might see people having both, right? One to kind of work through and talk through the issues that are coming up for you, and one to focus on the medications that you might be on. Money. Talk about how much they make, right? This is on average in 2019 in California, just to kind of put it in perspective. So it might be a little higher now. Our statistics are usually a few years back. On average, a counseling psychologist makes about 95,000 plus a year. On average. Now, this obviously depends on how many clients you have, right? How often you're working, if you have a specialty area or not. But on average, about 95,000. I have a friend who's a counseling psychologist. I asked him this, which probably isn't the nicest thing, but we're close enough I can ask him. He said he makes closer to like 140,000 a year, but he works in Calabasas and he works with like a higher level population. So sometimes that can change it a little bit. Clinical, about 110,000 a year on average. Right, again, more education, you hope you'd make more, you have more student loans to pay off at that point, right? And then finally, psychiatrists, are you ready to change your career path here? 242,000 on average a year. Right, you're like, I know what I want to do. But I mean, again, a lot of school, right? Like have a very, like a lot of education and background in that. Sorry, I didn't mean to make this so long. That was it. But you can see different amounts of training, different amounts of like salary, different focus. So clinical counseling and psychiatry are sometimes like collectively referred to as therapy. But when people go to therapy, it's usually one of these first two. And then psychiatrists have a slightly different focus. And again, quite a bit more money. School psychologists work in schools, right? They typically have a master's degree as well. So 2 to 3 years. Of education. They do a lot of assessments on students and like providing services in a school setting, sometimes intelligence testing and aptitude testing as well. Social workers typically also have a master's degree, a master's of social work, and working on the intersections and interactions between different like elements in someone's life. So they might be coordinating services between a therapist and a teacher and a family in the law. Right, they tend to work with more like social, like bigger groups, and the interactions and intersections of multiple groups and people. Clinical researchers carry out research, right? And so looking at like and answering questions in the field, you could be a forensic psychologist where you look at the intersections of law and psychology, which we'll talk about at the end of the semester, looking at things like insanity, and maybe even testifying in court. You could obviously do academic counseling on a campus. I did that for a few years as well. You could teach. There's so many different options in this field, though for most of them, you need at least a master's degree, right? Pretty common to need a master's or higher. Any thoughts here? Anything about the different degrees or professions? Any thoughts, questions, comments at all? Yeah.
But not that you get paid basically like around the same for all the different like fields and a little bit different.
Sure. I mean, it depends. So people who have a PhD, which is typically like anything with clinical in front of it, tend to make more, right? I won't say it's a perfect rule, but generally the more education and training you have, the more money you tend to make. Not always true, right? But people who are clinical researchers do tend, or like clinical psychiatrists, psychologists tend to make more than people who just have a master's most of the time. I would say social workers and school psychologists tend to be pretty on par here. And they have about the same level of education, which tends to help. With my degree in psychology, so I got a bachelor's in psych. With my bachelor's in psych, I managed a warehouse music, which are no longer around, makes me feel good to say that. I managed a Starbucks and I managed an REI. Those are the things I did with my bachelor's in psych, but it made me stand out beyond other people who didn't have a degree. With my master's in psychology, I was an advisor and an academic counselor. So students would come to me to help with like their education plans. I was a therapeutic behavioral aide, so worked one-on-one typically with kids and families who needed help with like behaviors. Then I became a therapist intern and then a teaching intern and then eventually like a professor and then also a researcher. I do a lot of research as well. So again, lots of different options here, very degree dependent. And as a kind of a way to like think about therapy a little bit more, I want you to find a couple of people around you. And we'll do this a few times during the semester. We're going to think about some stereotypes of therapy, just for a moment. I think it's a good place to do it. So find like 2, 3, 4 people, whatever's easy. Introduce yourself really quickly. I know we're still getting to know each other, and then I'll tell you what I want you to do from there. So find a few people around you, and then I'll tell you what's next.
I'm more.
So bad. I hate that here.
We can do whatever. If you want to always get around, there's less stereotypes. I think it's not the choice side of the road. It's a side.
All right, everybody have a group? I kind of told you a little bit. Let me give you more. What I want you to do in your group, and somebody can jot this down so you can share it, or you can just remember it, it's up to you. But what are some of the stereotypes or associations that you have with therapy, therapists, people who go to therapy? What would you expect to happen in therapy? Anything related to therapy. So let me give you one. This is like the hallmark stereotype, right? How does that make you feel? That's gonna be said somewhere in there. How does that make you feel? The follow-up to that, by the way, is I'm not about that, right? Like, so the head nod and everything. But think about some things you think of, right? It could be good or bad stereotypes, but anything related to therapy, therapists, people who go, what's in the room, what's gonna happen, all that kind of stuff. So jot it down so you can share. I'll give you a few minutes and then we'll talk about it together.
Oh, yeah, that's
But I've gone through very small. A lot, like.
Then we'll talk about it together. So you might have to share. It's up to you. You're not turning it in.
You can relate to them, but they've got, out there. That makes sense.
quiet. Well, we can talk about it together, right? And you'll come up with more as we talk about it. What are some things that you came up with? Anyone want to share one? Yeah.
Long couch.
A long couch, for sure, right? And usually like a really uncomfortable one. Freud started the idea of the couch, right? I'll show you a picture of it at the next week at some point. What else? Okay, long couch, for sure. What else have we got? Some movement, yeah.
I like that sometimes state, like they say, oh, I go to therapy, and they kind of just assume like you're either depressed, you're sad, or you're
Yeah.
like issues, but it's just have to be like depression.
Yeah, we tend to have a really negative stigma of therapy, right? That like, oh, you're going to therapy, uh-oh, right? Like there's gotta be something going on that's bad, rather than maybe you just are seeking support, right? I like that. There were a couple other things, yeah.
We talk about like being scared of judgment, like we think that the therapist is gonna judge us.
Oh, sure.
And also something else that I thought about, like this person knows if I'm scared, just like depending on with like body language.
Okay.
So this person has like secret, not knows what I call it.
I like that, right? They have secret powers. They're looking at everything that you do, everything that's meaningful, right? Sometimes. Yeah. And that may or may not be true, right? Yeah.
I was gonna say the stereotype of therapist being shrinks.
Being a shrink.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned that. So little random piece of information for you. The term shrink comes from the idea that, so here I have it written down. The originates from head shrinker, or someone who shrinks someone's head, to the primitive tribal practices of shrinking the heads of your enemies. Right, so that's where the term shrink comes from, that they're going to shrink your head like your enemy, right? Like, and that's kind of, I think, kind of speaks to the stereotypes that we have of what therapy is and what it looks like. So kind of a negative reference. What else? What else is in the room? What else is going to happen? What are they going to say? Tell me more, right? Tell me more about that, right? What else? I once said, how does it make you feel in therapy as a therapist? And then I apologized and never said it. It's so stereotypical. Yeah.
Maybe the therapist has like a perfect life and they have everything together, but just that they're giving advice.
Sure, on the other side of the room, right, they have everything all together, right? Sitting there in jackets, give us advice. What else? Anything else you would expect to see in the room? Like, or like I picture degrees on the wall. It's always gonna be lots of degrees to, verify that you have the right to be in there. Yeah. Okay, leg crossed. What else are they doing with their leg crossed? They're writing on a notepad, right? They're taking notes. I picture the bobblehead like, like tell me more about that, just on a repeat, right? Anything else? What else do you picture? In my mind, there's always like a rock garden or like a little fountain or something, and there's something like, you had your hand up today, so you
Oh, no, that's okay. I feel like I'm doing this therapist.
okay, yeah, I instantly think of women as well, like it's not stereotype, older glasses. Right? Anybody else? What else? Anything related to that?
I don't know why, but I can't picture sort of a long kind of office without like a house plant.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. So I have no problem like sharing this. Like I go to therapy. I have for years, right? It feels like hypocritical to train to be a therapist and then not like go to therapy yourself. And they actually encourage that quite a bit. As part of being an American Family Therapist intern, they give 2 hours for every 1 hour you go to therapy. So they reward you for going. So I've been going for years. My therapist cannot keep plants alive. So she now has all fake plants because they were all dead everywhere. She's all like, I promise I'm better at therapy than I am at gardening. We'll see, right? But I think the world of her. I like her quite a bit. Whenever I think of therapy, I think of something she always says, which is don't forget to practice self-care. And I roll my eyes every time she says it. And I changed it in my mind to self-cake. So every time she says practice self-care, I'm like, I will practice self-cake this weekend, right? It's kind of a joke with me. Like, I have cake to care for myself. That's my therapy care right there. Anything else that you wrote down or came up with? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm like, wait, oh. Yes, right, our time is up, right? Yeah, that's always the thing I said at the end, right? Unfortunately, we're out of time. We're like, let's shop that for next week.
Your session is almost over.
Your session is almost over, right? Of course, right? I always have the stereotype that everything ends perfectly just as you're out of time. That rarely happens, right? On either end of therapy. Anything else? Yeah. Right, yeah, for sure.
I
Yeah,
think like fidgets, I feel like the person talking fidgets.
okay, there's something that they fidget with, right? Anybody else? Anything else that came to mind? Yeah. Yeah, right, let's draw that out, or let's create some like things that we put up for that, yeah.
What do you see?
Oh, what do you see here, Rorschachs and ink blots and like looking at ambiguous stimuli. So many stereotypes, and some of them are true, right? And there are good therapists and bad therapists, and we'll talk a lot more about different types of therapy as we go through this semester. But some of those stereotypes absolutely hold up, right? And others don't. And I think therapy in general is very stigmatized, which is a shame because I think most of us could benefit from having a neutral third party to talk to, even though you do have to pay them, or somebody has to pay them for that service. So, anything else before we move on? I don't want to rob you of you if you had a good one to share. All right, we'll look at more later, but yeah, I think those are all the things I had down. Yeah, or that they're always analyzing people is another one that I have. The second I tell anyone that I teach psychology, there's always a response that comes with it every time. It'll be like, what do you do for a living? Oh, I teach at North Park College. And it's like, oh, that's exciting. Like, what do you teach? The second I say psychology, it's this. It's like, oh. And they back up, like literally back up and cover themselves. Like I'm analyzing them in that moment, right? And I have a friend who I was in my graduate program with, and she's always the therapist. It's obnoxious. Like every time I talk to her, it's like, oh, well, that's okay. It's part of her process. And like, just take your therapist hat off for a minute. It's obnoxious, right? It's a lot of work to analyze people. The therapists aren't normally always doing that. Some might, my friend always says. And so I've learned not to talk to her. I'll be like, oh, my daughter's not sleeping. That's the process. No, it's not. You know, it's like, it's disrupting my process, right? But lots of interesting stereotypes. Again, we'll talk about those as we go. And that was our last for chapter 1, which is kind of exciting. So what we'll do on on Wednesday, is we will cover chapter 2. We'll start talking about the models of abnormality. We have chapters 2 and 3 to continue setting the stage. So let me take attendance one more time today and Wednesday, just to continue making sure who's here. Let me turn this off. And then as we move into Wednesday, again, we'll start chapter 2.